Hey guys, tonight we will explore the strangest things you didn't know about Henry VIII. Things few dare to speak of, or that history has deliberately hidden behind the Tudor throne. Imagine a king in all his glory, a grand stage of power, yet behind it lie horrific ulcers, paralyzing terror, and merciless decisions that hardly anyone dares mention. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your local area. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry VIII, also known as Henry Tudor, inherited the English throne in the year 1509 at the age of 18, with a tall, athletic frame standing 6 feet 2 inches and hair the colour of spun gold gleaming in the sunlight. Back then, he spoke as many as 4 languages, composed music, penned poetry, and captivated European courts with his graceful oratory. His songs and verses echoed through royal palaces, commanding admiration wherever they were heard. Contemporary accounts record that he possessed smooth, fair skin, a proud gaze, and an enchanting smile that won the hearts of countless ladies at court. In his early reign, images of Henry VIII appeared in solemn portraits, posed in powerful, regal stances, an embodiment of a prince both gifted and noble, promising a brilliant future for the kingdom. Yet behind that dazzling facade lay a burning desire to secure his dynasty and the heavy burden of European monarchical tradition. At every court session, the young king donned sumptuous garments and made formal obeisance before his councillors. But within his heart lingered a painful void. He had no firstborn son to carry on the Tudor line. That absence fanned the flames of absolute authority and personal ambition in Henry's mind, laying the groundwork for the tragic chapters to come. In the opening years of his rule, Henry VIII displayed lavish generosity through grand hunting expeditions and martial sports such as jousting and swordplay. He poured vast resources into the construction of Hampton Court Palace, the project costing tens of thousands of pounds by the standards of the day. Its honey-coloured stone walls, winding galleries, and lush gardens transformed the palace into a rare marvel of splendour. Equally, his passion for war against France led him into 2 campaigns from 1512 to 1514, then again from 1522 to 1525, spending millions of pounds, yet achieving only minor skirmishes with no lasting political gain. The clang of steel and roar of battle faded, leaving only smoke and a hollow ache in the king's heart. Even at the height of his vigour, Henry initiated religious reform while outwardly remaining loyal to the Roman Catholic Church. The fervent debates over his divorce from Queen Catherine of Aragon began taking shape by the mid-1520s, when he petitioned the papal court to annul the marriage and claimed sovereignty over the English Church. This bold move paved the way for seismic change. Religious authority severed from Rome, with the king declaring himself supreme head of his national church. Despite opposition from nobles and clerics, Henry pressed on, marking a turning point in English history and leaving an indelible legacy of a monarch who would not bow to any power. In the sleepy hush of the night, the image of that young king seems to rise anew from the pages of ancient chronicles, carrying with him both glorious memories and deep unrest. Those resolute footsteps of Henry VIII laid the foundation for a remarkable saga from radiant heights to tragic depths waiting to be uncovered in the chapters ahead. Let your mind drift, lulled by your slow, even breaths, as this Tudor tale gradually unfolds before you. 38 years later, the image of that once glorious monarch existed only in dusty tomes. Henry weighed more than 400 pounds, requiring mechanical hoists just to dress and undress him each morning. The festering ulcer on his leg, a lingering legacy of that grievous jousting accident in the year 1537, had become a revolting nightmare. Its stench was so overpowering that courtiers drew lots to determine who would approach him for treatment, each person holding their breath and pinching their nostrils shut as they knelt beside the royal dais. The putrid odour drifted through the vast chambers like a dark cloud, turning the palace into a labyrinth of suffocating gloom. No longer the lithe huntsman who had roamed greenwood forests at dawn, Henry relied on bearers to carry him from room to room, his once powerful legs now virtually useless. Sleepless nights, tormented by unrelenting pain, frayed his nerves and sharpened his temper. To guard against would-be assassins, or perhaps driven by paranoia itself, He stationed loaded crossbows by his bedside, weapons cocked and ready should any shadow flicker too close. The so-called treatments were no less barbaric than the weapons he trusted. Red-hot iron rods seared his wound, and powders of ash and salt were rubbed into the raw flesh, spreading agony instead of healing. Where once he had been known for lofty generosity, Henry now became notorious for distrust. He scorned the advice of every court physician, certain they harboured poison alongside their remedies. His apothecary chest swelled to hold more than 300 bizarre concoctions. Powdered unicorn horn actually crushed narwhal tusk prescribed to ward off toxins, finely ground pearl for melancholy, and human skull moss, believed to cure epilepsy. The court's treasury groaned under the cost. Modern scholars estimate the king spent the equivalent of millions of dollars on these costly and frequently useless elixirs. Rage and fear intertwined in his psyche, each feeding the other until Henry's justice became capricious and cruel. 2 wives, first Catherine of Aragon, then Anne Boleyn, fell victim to edicts harsher than any medieval code would have allowed. Catherine's marriage was annulled amid scandal and heartache, her bloodline severed despite years of loyal service to the crown. Anne, once the queen whose grace and wit had bewitched him, faced a sham trial in which her honour was destroyed by forced confessions and public spectacle. The executioner's blade fell before the court could prove any genuine crime. Courtiers whispered that Henry had abandoned the rule of law, replacing it with the whims of a tormented soul. Legal procedures were ignored, or twisted to fit the sovereign's demands. Hearings were held in secret, verdicts delivered on suspicion alone. In just a few years, the same justice that once protected noble rights became a tool of terror. Accused men vanished overnight, their estates confiscated, their families left destitute. To cross the king meant exile or worse. As sleepless nights bled into sunless dawns, Henry's kingdom felt the strain of his absence and wrath. The lords brought their petitions to empty thrones, praying for mercy that rarely came. Peasants trembled at rumours of fresh fines and forced levies. The palace corridors, once alive with music and laughter, echoed now only with the groans of the suffering and the squeak of leather on machinery as attendants lifted the ailing monarch. In that dim era, the Tudor splendour was but a fading echo. Portraits commissioned to convey majesty instead captured a bloated figure adorned in padded robes and voluminous furs, a grotesque parody of the warrior prince he had been. The famous Holbein images, meant to immortalize regal poise, instead immortalized the tragic decline. Broad shoulders hunched, swollen legs hidden beneath a cascade of fabric. The codpiece that once symbolized virility now seemed an absurd exaggeration, dwarfed by the king's sheer bulk. Yet, in his darkest hours, Henry's mind flickered with the remnants of ambition and brilliance that had marked his youth. He continued to draft statutes and manage state affairs, his signature looping and elaborate, a testament to his stubborn will to govern, despite the agony that twisted his body. Those who observed him at council meetings noted the tremor in his hand, the occasional slackening of his gaze as pain threatened to overwhelm him. And still, at times, he would rally himself to speak with fierce clarity, issuing commands that shaped the future of England. The tragic irony lay in his self-fashioned title as Supreme Head of the Church of England. By separating from Rome, he had seized spiritual and temporal power, yet in the end he became a prisoner of his own body and his own wrath. The very authority he crafted to secure his legacy turned against him, fueling the paranoia that isolated him from the allies he once trusted. Thus, the once radiant sovereign of yesteryear was reduced to a recluse in his own court, attended only by those bound by duty or fear. Each shout of "Your Majesty" echoed hollowly off the cold stone walls, and every curt "As you wish, sire," concealed trembling hearts. The grand halls that had hosted sumptuous banquets lay silent, save for the soft drip of ointment and the distant chime of a chamber clock marking yet another hour of suffering. In this relentless twilight of his reign, Henry VIII embodied the peril of absolute power in a frail, tormented frame. His body broken, his spirit embittered, he stood as a haunting emblem that a once vibrant ruler, blessed with intellect and charm, could be undone by misfortune, medical ignorance, and unbridled authority, an allegory whispered among hushed courtiers, and preserved for posterity in chronicles steeped in sorrow. The pivotal shift in Henry's temperament began with a dreadful accident on the 24th of January in the year 1536. During a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, his warhorse reared and then collapsed, hurling the king's powerful frame to the ground beneath its stomping hooves. Court physicians recorded that His Majesty lay unconscious for 2 full hours. An extraordinary span in an age when losing consciousness beyond mere minutes often spelled certain death. Witnesses later described the scene in hushed tones. One moment, the prince was the very embodiment of vigour and skill. The next, he lay motionless, his helmet dented, his mind veiled in darkness. In 2016, Dr. Armenstein's careful review of contemporary medical accounts confirmed the presence of severe traumatic brain injury. He noted evidence of intracranial bleeding and focused damage to the frontal lobes, the regions responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation. This scientific perspective sheds chilling light on Henry's notorious post-accident cruelty. Before 1536, executions were relatively rare, adhering closely to legal procedures. Afterwards, the royal decree for beheadings and imprisonments surged, sometimes over trifles or mere suspicions. Historians now surmise that the wrecked circuitry of Henry's brain made him more prone to rage and less able to temper his darkest impulses. At the same time, the physical trauma reawakened an old torment. The varicose ulcer on his left leg, first wounded in a tilt 5 years earlier, erupted with renewed ferocity, oozing dark pus and emitting a stench so foul that even seasoned court attendants balked at drawing near. Medieval remedies proved, as brutal as they were, ineffective. Red-hot irons pressed to cauterize the wound, poultices of crushed herbs steeped in foul water, and even probationary immersion of his foot in pungent decoctions. Rather than soothe, these treatments often intensified his agony. Eventually, Henry was fitted with custom cloth-lined shoes to bear his weight, each step a reminder of the injury that had shattered his body. No longer could he pace the corridors or ride out to the hunting grounds. He spent his days slumped on a chaise longue, eyes shut tight, jaw clenched against the constant throb. The changes wrought in his psyche were unmistakable. He came to trust no one, not even his closest confidants. Courtiers recount how he would demand that any dish prepared for him be tasted first by his own hand, to prove it was not laced with poison. Chefs were kept under watch, forbidden even to speak unless directly addressed by royal command, their every move shadowed by fear. Mirrors, once symbols of royal vanity, were banned from his presence, for he could not bear the sight of his own haggard reflection. Pallid cheeks hollowed by pain, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, features distorted by swelling. In his former youth, he had delighted in his own handsome visage. Now, that same image became a source of torment, a reminder that his body had betrayed him utterly. As the days dragged on in this weary rhythm, Henry's court grew tense with unease. No longer did noblemen present petitions with the customary flourish. Instead, they crept forward, heads bowed, careful not to startle the tormented king. Each petition concluded with a whispered plea for mercy, aware that one misstep, a stumble over words, a perceived hesitation could be construed as disloyalty. By contrast, the king's own words became clipped and harsh, delivered between laboured breaths. The man who once issued pronouncements of mercy and justice now seemed to dispense decrees born of paranoia and pain. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace lay draped in silver moonlight, Henry sometimes awakened in a panic, convinced the shadows themselves harboured assassins. He would grasp at the handles of his bed, his fingers pale and trembling, and call out for the chamberlain, insisting that the crossbows be checked, that the locks be secured, that no whisper go unheard. These episodes left him drained, yet fearful he might sleep again without warning, stirring only to discover his end had come in the night. The boundaries between mind and body, between sovereign and suffering man, blurred completely. Thus, the tragedy that began on that fateful January afternoon rippled outward through every facet of his reign. The once mighty Henry VIII, the athletic prince, the patron of the arts, the charismatic monarch, had been irrevocably altered by a single jousting mishap. A man who once strode confidently across fields of battle now stumbled through corridors of dread, sustained by crude mechanisms and broken promises of healing. And so his life unfolded in a haze of pain, suspicion, and relentless gloom, a testament to how swiftly fortune's favour can crumble under the weight of trauma and fear. Chronic pain, and the ceaseless fear of illness, transformed the emperor into a deranged physician of his own ailments. Day and night, Dozens of court surgeons, apothecaries, and folk healers rotated through his chambers, each bearing new concoctions and dubious promises of relief. The royal infirmary, once a modest collection of salves and simples, swelled to a vast arsenal of herbal powders, mineral pastes, and mystical talismans. Prescription scrolls brimmed with inscrutable commands. 2 ounces of finely ground pearl, half an ounce of powdered unicorn horn, turtle shell fragments steeped in honey. Many of these remedies proved as toxic as they were, pointless, provoking waves of nausea, dizziness, and utter exhaustion. The noxious odours of these poultices and potions compounded his suffering. Courtiers, whether high-ranking earls or humble scribes, approached the royal presence with handkerchiefs clamped tightly over nose and mouth, speaking only through gauzy curtains to avoid the stench. The whispered concern, "His Majesty is gravely ill," rippled through the corridors like a curse. Baron and commoner alike trembled at the very notion of offering advice, for any suggestion of change risked being branded disloyal. The once revered sovereign now met even the gentlest counsel with bitter suspicion, regarding all dissent as treason against his person. Sleep, too, became a battleground. Insomnia gnawed at him in fits of manic wakefulness, leaving his mind racing through darkest imaginings. Then, when exhaustion finally claimed him, he would slumber for staggering spans, sometimes 18 hours at a stretch, only to awaken disoriented and enraged. In the dead hush of pre-dawn, he might erupt in fury at the slightest provocation. An advisor who accidentally brushed the king's pillow could find his head on a chopping block by sunrise. Those nocturnal outbursts blurred the lines between royal justice and personal vengeance. Any utterance of criticism, however mild, invited confiscation of lands, imprisonment without trial, or worse. Under the banner of royal security, Henry wielded power with indiscriminate cruelty. A whispered joke in private chambers, a cautious question about church reforms, even a misplaced glance could suffice to invoke severe punishment. Noble estates were seized overnight, servants cast into dank dungeons, families left destitute. The legal system, once the bulwark of order, buckled beneath the weight of the king's unbridled whims. Within the labyrinthine halls of Whitehall, rumours swirled of secret arrest orders slipped beneath chamber doors. Gentlemen in waiting moved like shadows, eyes downcast, hands trembling as they delivered messages sealed with the royal cipher. The stewards who managed the king's household dared not meet his gaze, for even their slightest misstep could lead to disgrace. Servants whispered prayers before entering his chamber, crossing themselves at the threshold, uncertain whether they would exit as before or not at all. Despite this atmosphere of terror, Henry's obsession with his own health persisted. He insisted on personally sampling every medicinal potion, no matter how foul, to ensure it was not laced with poison. Royal tasters, once employed for vineyards and feasts, were redeployed to test bizarre elixirs, pearl dust, mixed with verjuice, powdered toadstone blended into cold cures, and fiery salts, claimed to burn away malignant humours. The king's bowels rebelled against these grotesque therapies, leaving him debilitated and bedridden for days on end. Yet even in his agony, Henry remained convinced that some miracle remedy awaited discovery. He pored over the marginalia of medical treatises, his eyes flicking across Latin passages on humoral imbalance, desperate for a clue. Monks in remote abbeys received sudden summons to the court, bearing manuscripts of arcane healing rites, chants for pestilence, diagrams of alchemical distillation to extract essence of life. None brought relief, but each reinforced his delusion that the next wonder cure might restore him to the vigor of youth. Meanwhile, the kingdom writhed beneath the weight of his paranoia. Tax farmers, once ignored pests, now fled the realm rather than risk collecting the king's new levies. Tradesmen haggled in market squares over soaring food prices, blaming that cursed ulcer for every hardship. The church, torn between loyalty to the monarch and compassion for the people, faltered under conflicting demands. Support the royal supremacy or risk excommunication by Rome. Priests preached carefully, their homilies studiously neutral, fearful that the slightest doctrinal misstep might draw Henry's ire. By day, the castle gates stood open for petitions. By night, they were barred to all but a select few. Messengers carried news of uprisings in the north, rebellions sparked by forced dissolution of monasteries, but the king greeted such reports with icy indifference or frantic fear, depending on the hour. His counsellors, once confident statesmen, now spoke in hushed tones, poisoning their words with deference and dread. In those sombre years, his empire felt the absence of benevolent rule. Charters remained unsealed, legal disputes stagnated, and foreign ambassadors left with uneasy memories of sequestered audiences. England's reputation as a rising power dimmed, eclipsed by the savage rumours of its ruler's madness. The once celebrated monarch, whose early patronage had welcomed artists and humanists, ended his reign as a cautionary tale whispered in candlelit chambers across Europe. And so the chronic agony and unrelenting fear transformed Henry into a tyrant convinced that dominion over death itself were within his grasp, yet powerless to free himself from the torment within. The court, a stage for legend and grandeur, had become a theatre of shadows, where every gesture risked condemnation, and every remedy bore the taint of poison. In the end, the very empire he had forged bowed not to his might, but to the relentless march of pain and paranoia that consumed his final days. Supreme power over the Church of England, enshrined in the Act of Supremacy in the year 1534, was far from a moral awakening. It was instead the fit of rage of a man unwilling to tolerate any denial of his personal desires. Though Henry VIII initially proclaimed his unwavering loyalty to the Roman Catholic faith, hesitation on the part of Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon drove the king to a drastic solution. Without a second thought, he declared himself supreme head of the church in his realm, severing ties with Rome, and elevating his own will above centuries of ecclesiastical authority. The implications for clergy and commoners alike were immediate and severe. All subjects, whether humble parish priests or lofty bishops, were compelled to take an oath acknowledging Henry's supremacy over church doctrine. Failure to comply was deemed high treason, punishable by death. Elegant cathedrals and monastic orders that had stood for generations found themselves forced to choose between loyalty and survival. Between the years 1536 and 1541, monasteries, abbeys, and convents across England were systematically dissolved. Their lands, precious manuscripts, and vast treasuries estimated at £1,300,000 in Tudor currency, an amount swelling to over $1 billion by modern reckoning, were confiscated and funneled into the royal coffers. This sudden influx of wealth fueled Henry's extravagant ambitions. He poured the seized funds into the construction and refurbishment of his palaces, lavishly outfitting them with tapestries, silverware, and rare marbles. He expanded his war chest to finance new garrisons and maintain soldiers in France, even as those campaigns yielded little more than skirmishes and fleeting triumphs. A portion of the proceeds also found its way into his growing obsession with eccentric medical treatments. Ingredients for arcane salves, jars of unicorn horn powder, and crates of exotic spices believed to fortify the body against humours gone awry. Yet despite these vast expenditures, the realm saw no lasting peace, no enduring prosperity. In fact, the rapid dissolution of religious houses disrupted social welfare systems that had provided alms to the poor, medical care to the sick, and shelter to travellers, leaving vulnerable communities adrift. Within the glittering halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court alike, courtiers began to speak in hushed tones of their once admired monarch. The young prince who had so easily captivated Europe's courts was now referred to as the Black Devil, a spectral figure haunting his subjects with dread. The jovial huntsman, whose laughter once echoed across deer-filled glades, now prowled the corridors with a cruel impatience, hunting down dissenting voices as though they were game. Religious law and royal warrants, once respected bulwarks of order, became weapons to justify arbitrary cruelty. Under the guise of spiritual purity, Henry sanctioned the arrest of any cleric found whispering doubts about the supremacy oath. Entire families were stripped of titles and income if a single son or brother was accused of papist sympathies. The transformation was staggering. Where once Henry's rule had inspired loyalty through benevolence and chivalric patronage, it now relied on fear and suspicion. Nobles who had brought lavish gifts and felicitous counsel were replaced by favourites who basked in the king's fickle favour, only to fall from grace at the slightest whisper of insubordination. The machinery of governance ground on, but its gears were oiled with terror. Reports of secret tribunals circulated through candlelit dining rooms, men accused of heresy or treason disappearing into the Fleet prison, never to re-emerge. Wives and daughters of the condemned petitioned the king for clemency, only to receive terse edicts denying all mercy. Even the spiritual tone of the realm shifted dramatically. Sermons delivered in once-storied pulpits now echoed with proclamations of royal supremacy rather than the comforting tenets of faith. Parishioners, accustomed to communal rites of baptism and confession, found themselves performing quick affirmations of loyalty to the crown before any mass could begin. Those who hesitated, perhaps moved by genuine conscience, risked the label of traitor, their reputations blackened, and their properties forfeit to the crown's insatiable appetite. Amid this climate of coercion, the art and architecture that had flourished under Henry's earlier patronage took on a darker cast. Tapestries depicting biblical themes were reworked to emphasize the king's divine right. Scenes of the Last Supper now placed under banners proclaiming the king's supremacy. Portraitists were instructed to paint the royal figure draped in ecclesiastical vestments, replacing mitres and croziers with royal regalia. The Book of Common Prayer lay unfinished on monks' desks, its manuscript seized and repurposed for royal propaganda, while copies smuggled abroad became prized relics among exiled Catholics. In these years of relentless reform, Henry's vision of religious unity under his sole authority came at a terrible cost. The social fabric, once woven through acts of charity by monastic orders, unravelled in towns and hamlets. The impoverished left without the aid of former abbeys turned to crime or vagrancy. Local markets, once thriving under the protection of church tithes, faltered as farmers struggled with new taxes and ever-tightening royal controls. Even the king's own subjects, those who might have cheered his early triumphs, found themselves yearning for the familiar certainty of a faith that transcended crown and country. Thus, the very instrument Henry devised to secure his legacy, the Act of Supremacy, served instead to cast a long shadow over his reign. It revealed a man who, in his desperation to bend spiritual authority to his will, unleashed forces that fractured society rather than forging it together. In the hush of twilight, as torchlight flickered across the walls of Hampton Court, courtiers whispered prayers not for the king's glory, but for the soul of a nation torn between loyalty and conscience, forever marked by the fury of a monarch who would not be denied. Throughout his reign, Henry spent lavishly to craft an image of unassailable power and prosperity. Hampton Court Palace, the grandest architectural marvel of its day, consumed over £62,000 in Tudor currency, the equivalent of roughly £50 million today, merely to lay stone floors, adorn walls with ornate carvings, and hang silken tapestries that shimmered in torchlight. He maintained a court exceeding 1,000 souls: ministers, knights, cooks, musicians, dancers, and guards, each day provided with sustenance, fabric, and splendid attire. His wardrobe alone boasted more than 2,000 items, ranging from horsehair, padded doublets sculpting a robust chest, to codpieces stuffed with sawdust and even whalebone, a grotesque symbol of masculine authority. Yet these tremendous expenditures yielded no lasting financial security. When customary revenues from taxes proved insufficient, Henry enacted the so-called amicable grant in the year 1525, a desperate levy that plunged both peasants and townsfolk into hardship and nearly sparked open revolt. To recoup expenses, he dissolved monasteries across the realm, seizing annual incomes, estimated at £1,300,000 a windfall, surpassing $1 billion modern dollars. Yet this spectacle of confiscations failed to cover the mounting costs of governance and warfare. Common folk cursed the heavy burdens placed upon them, while coinage suffered repeated debastements, mixing copper and lead into silver. Ruthless inflation followed, causing the price of grain and everyday goods to soar, plunging ordinary households into crisis. Amid mounting discontent and empty coffers, Henry turned to artistic propaganda to mask the brewing turmoil. He commissioned Hans Holbein the Younger and other court painters to craft portraits that concealed his physical decline and implied divine favour. Broad shoulders and elevated platforms hid his swollen legs, padded robes disguised his bulging torso, and meticulously rendered details diverted attention from any sign of weakness. He branded his dynasty the magnanimous monarchy, etching the motto Dieu et mon droit, God and my right, in gilded script on banners and seals. His envoys distributed crystal-etched royal emblems to foreign courts, each a small showcase of Tudor magnificence. This orchestrated pageantry sustained Henry's majestic image long after the festive banquet halls had grown silent. Visitors to the palace beheld opulent chambers awash in candle glow. Yet behind each velvet curtain lay the king's private torment, the ulcer that festered unseen, the sleepless nights haunted by fear, and the heart heavy with suspicion. The grand facade of power masked an empire teetering on the brink, financially strained, socially fractured, and governed by a sovereign whose benevolence had been supplanted by cruelty. The dissolution of monastic charity devastated the poor and displaced countless lay workers who had depended upon abbey alms and hospital care. Villagers who once sought comfort in the abbey's infirmary now found doors locked and gates barred. Towns turned to petty crime as an alternative to starvation. Itinerant beggars drifted from one district to another, the echoes of their pleas swallowed by the hush of empty cloisters. The shared rituals that had woven social cohesion unraveled, leaving communities adrift and wary of both crown and church. Meanwhile, Henry's relentless commissioning of lavish festivities continued unabated. State banquets overflowed with exotic spices, imported venison, and elaborate sugar sculptures themselves, status symbols of royal wealth. Troops of players and minstrels paraded through corridors, their music and dance meant to soothe the populace on edge. Yet these spectacles, dazzling in their extravagance, were also bitter reminders of inequality, for the splendor of the dining halls stood in stark contrast to the empty larders of commoners. Throughout Europe, diplomats noted the spectacle with a mix of admiration and unease. Reports from foreign ambassadors described a king clad in royal purple and resplendent jewels, yet moved with the stiffness of a man burdened by suffering. The Tudor court became legend as much for its magnificence as for its rumours of madness, a realm of velvet and iron, where courtiers trembled at the feast, but feared the turning tide that could bring ruin at any moment. In the quiet of his private chambers, Henry would survey the results of his propaganda machine. Gilded maps displaying expanded territories, heraldic tapestries celebrating military exploits, and missives from grateful nobles swearing fealty to his supremacy. He found solace in these symbols, as though the weight of each golden coin and embroidered banner could stave off the creeping decay within his own flesh. Yet every triumph felt hollow, for the king knew that true stability could not be conjured by artifice alone. As dusk fell on another day of courtly pageantry, the torches flickered against polished armour and marble pillars. Beneath the hushed conversations of dukes and earls lay a shared awareness. The kingdom's foundation had begun to crack. The sumptuous attire and imposing palaces, once sources of national pride, now struck many as fragile veneers, concealing a brittle order. Henry's relentless pursuit of grandeur had provided fleeting distraction, but offered no cure for the deep wounds inflicted by war, religious upheaval, and economic strain. Thus, the legacy of Henry VIII's majesty remains entwined with the tragedy of his reign. The bones of monastic ruins, the clatter of debased coins, and the silence of shuttered abbeys stand alongside the splendor of palace halls. His portrait endures as a testament to ambition's allure, even as it warns of the perils of excess unchecked by wisdom or compassion. In hushed tones, storytellers across the ages remind us, beneath every throne of gold lies the shadow of those who paid the price, and beneath every crown of finery, the weight of a ruler's unbridled desire. Beside his masterful propaganda, Henry unleashed a merciless purge. By the end of his 38-year reign, it is estimated that more than 70,000 souls had been sentenced to death, averaging 5 executions by beheading or hanging each day. The names of his victims span the spectrum of Tudor society, from lofty peers to humble commoners. Among the most renowned was Sir Thomas More, the devoted Lord Chancellor who refused to swear the oath of supremacy in 1534. Accused of high treason for placing conscience above royal command, More faced the block with undaunted faith. His final words, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," resonated as a clarion call for freedom of conscience, an enduring symbol of resistance against tyranny. But it was not only the great and the learned who perished. Sir William Kingston, the officer charged with carrying out royal sentences, recorded the grim spectacle of Queen Anne Boleyn's downfall. Anne, once the vibrant consort whose wit had captivated him, was forced to witness the torture of her brother and alleged accomplices before confessing to charges of adultery, charges now understood to have been fabricated. The stage trials were less inquiries into truth than performances of power. with scant evidence beyond hearsay and coerced testimonies. In Henry's unhinged paranoia, any perceived slight could metamorphose into capital accusations. Survival in such a climate required a willingness to subsume one's own identity beneath the will of the sovereign. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, secured her safety by consenting to be treated as the king's sister rather than queen. In doing so, she received a generous pension and the freedom to live quietly on her own estates, her compliance buying her a measure of security. Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, navigated the perilous waters of court life by becoming Henry's caretaker. She supervised his medical treatments, revised drafts of his writings, and carefully avoided any topic that might trigger his volatile temper. Both women survived by donning masks of obedience, sacrificing personal desires for the fragile gift of life. Even larger threats to the throne were met with unrelenting brutality. In 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace saw more than 40,000 northerners rise up in open protest against Henry's religious reforms. The rebels marched on York and besieged castles, demanding the restoration of dissolved monasteries and an end to royal overreach. Initially, the king offered terms of negotiation to lure the insurgents into a false sense of security. Once the ranks thinned and leaders disbanded to parley, Henry's forces swept in, seizing and executing rebelling lords with ruthless efficiency. The rivers of blood that followed served as a stark warning. Defiance of the supreme head would be met not with mercy, but with the blade. Under Henry's rule, the traditional bonds of fealty and mutual duty were supplanted by fear and suspicion. Families trembled at the knock of royal messengers, uncertain whether to expect a summons to court or the cold walls of a prison cell. Letters of pardon arrived as seldom as bromides of kindness, for the king viewed clemency as a sign of weakness. Estates confiscated from traitors fell into the treasury, only to be lavishly spent on the palace's next ostentatious display. Thus, every act of mercy denied deepened the perception of tyranny, even as each execution fortified the crown's authority. In this climate, loyalty became a precarious commodity. Courtiers jockeyed for favour, eager to demonstrate unwavering devotion, yet haunted by the knowledge that favour could evaporate with a single misstep. Sir Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's most trusted adviser and the architect of the Reformation in England, found himself ensnared in the same merciless machinery he had helped design. When the fifth marriage to Anne of Cleves collapsed under Henry's scathing judgment, Cromwell was accused of negligence and treason. He was executed less than a month later, his fall a chilling testament to the caprice of royal wrath. The purge extended even into the religious sphere that Henry had claimed to reform. Bishops who dared question the supremacy oath were arrested, churches closed, and conservative preachers silenced. The dissolution of monasteries not only confiscated wealth, but also destabilized local communities that had relied on monastic charity for care and sustenance. The lands once tilled by monks were granted to nobles and loyal courtiers, creating a new class of landowners indebted directly to the crown. Yet beneath this new order lay the seeds of discontent, for those displaced by the reforms found themselves disenfranchised and impoverished. Throughout England, the echoes of fear reverberated through market squares and manor houses alike. News of an execution spread like wildfire. The Earl of Surrey was beheaded this morning, or 6 gentlemen from Lancashire hanged at Lincoln. Each report reinforced the deadly message that resistance was not only futile, but fatal. Whispered warnings in inns and taverns warned travellers to steer clear of royal troops or risk arrest as suspected conspirators. The roads became lonely corridors of silence, as if the land itself were holding its breath against the next wave of terror. And yet, amidst the terror, Henry's court continued its grand routines: sumptuous banquets, tournaments of strength and skill, and religious services asserting his dominion over both throne and altar. The dissonance between nightly revelries and daily bloodshed revealed the stark contradictions of Tudor rule. In the flicker of torchlight and the clang of armour, one heard both triumphant fanfares and the muffled sobs of those who had lost kin to the king's merciless hand. This grim duality of life and death, celebration and sorrow, became the hallmark of Henry's reign. In the years following his death, the memory of these purges lingered like a pernicious ghost. England bore the scars of disrupted communities, shattered families, and a clergy forever cautious in its sermons. Yet Henry VIII's legacy of ruthless consolidation of power also laid foundations for a unified national church and a more centralized state apparatus. The bloodshed, though abhorrent, cemented the absolute authority of the monarch. It served as a harsh reminder that in Tudor England, the only law more feared than that of man was the decrees of its sovereign, a sovereign who would brook no opposition, treat mercy as weakness, and shape an era forever haunted by the spectre of his blackened crown. In the final years of his life, Henry bore the weight of a paradoxical legacy, a kingdom bankrupt and a faith torn asunder. His military ventures had faltered, draining the treasury dry, while lavish court expenditures kept pace with campaigns that achieved little beyond prideful boasts. In the end, what had begun as a flourishing realm was left with a deficit exceeding £4 million, a sum that would equate to countless billions of modern dollars. The 9-year-old Edward, his only male heir, inherited not only the crown, but the crushing burden of debt and unending religious strife. Edward's regents found themselves ensnared in the wreckage of Henry's ambitions. Soldiers remained unpaid, their loyalty wavering as mercenary captains pressed claims for back pay. Peasants and merchants, already stung by successive tax levies and currency debasements, bristled under the spectre of famine, unrest simmering in market towns and rural shires. Meanwhile, the young king's advisers struggled to maintain a fragile peace between Protestant reformers and remaining Catholic loyalists, each faction blaming Henry's broken promises for the chaos they now endured. Yet Henry's reformation of the Church of England, though motivated by personal expedience, laid the foundation for a national church independent of Rome. This structural shift would outlast dynasties, shaping English identity for generations to come. However, the violent rupture that had created it also seeded deep resentment. When Mary, Henry's daughter, and Edward's half-sister ascended the throne, she moved swiftly to reverse her father's policies. In the name of restoring the old faith, she authorized the execution of thousands of Protestants, earning the grim moniker Bloody Mary. Her reign became a dark echo of Henry's own ruthlessness, a reminder that zealotry knows no bounds, regardless of creed. Not long after, Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister and Henry's youngest child, took the reins of power. Her era, later celebrated as the Elizabethan Golden Age, brought renewed stability, artistic flourishing, and maritime ambition. Yet even Elizabeth inherited the fractured religious landscape her father had wrought. She strove for a middle way, instituting a compromise that affirmed royal supremacy over the church, while allowing some latitude for Protestant worship. The scars of her siblings' persecutions lingered in parish records, and many families remained bitter over lost lands and confiscated wealth from the monastic dissolutions of Henry's reign. In modern archives, scholars still pore over the engraved seals, trial transcripts, and medical accounts that chronicle Henry's tumultuous life. Manuscripts preserved at Cambridge describe the medieval attempts to cauterize his chronic leg ulcer procedures, now cited in contemporary studies of pain management and chronic venous disease. Psychologists reference Henry VIII as a case study in the devastating effects of traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic anxiety. Dr. Kira Kramer's research on venous insufficiency points out that the king's festering wound bears resemblance to modern patients who must undergo limb amputation to prevent systemic infection. Despite the centuries that separate us, Henry's story endures as a stark parable of absolute power, yoked to inescapable responsibility. He wielded religious reform as a tool for personal gain, transforming his marital dispute into a sweeping ecclesiastical revolution. He harnessed the zeal of faith to seize monastic wealth, only to squander it on vanity projects and misguided medical cures. He spilled blood to quash dissent, yet left the realm mired in fear and factional hate. His life underscores the peril that accompanies unrestrained authority, a sovereign who refuses to be told no, and a nation left to pick up the pieces of his unbridled ambition. In the hush of twilight, we might picture Henry as both architect and victim of his own designs, an emblem of human folly, his triumphs entwined with tragedy. His reign reminds us that the crown's weight is not measured in gold or vellum, but in the fragile welfare of the people it binds together. And so, as we drift to sleep with Henry's uneasy legacy in our thoughts, let us ponder the lesson written in his life's final pages, that the greatest power demands the greatest care, lest it consume both ruler and realm in its unrelenting flame. Henry's artistic patronage was inseparable from his hunger for propaganda. He summoned Hans Holbein the Younger to his court, commissioning portraits that captured the king's solemn dignity, while cleverly obscuring his painful leg ulcer and ample girth. Holbein's canvases presented Henry in resplendent robes, sashes clasped with jewelled brooches, and a gaze that spoke of unchallenged authority. Beyond portraiture, the Tudor administration issued woodcut engravings, minted coins, and distributed royal badges throughout Europe, each emblem a testament to the legitimacy and grandeur of Henry's monarchy. These images appeared in the hands of ambassadors, hanging in noble halls, and gleaming on merchant standards, all silent declarations of the king's supremacy. At a cultural level, Henry endeavoured to be more than a monarch. He styled himself as a patron of the arts and a scholar, king. His library at Hampton Court grew to house thousands of volumes, from illuminated manuscripts to contemporary treatises on law and theology. He extended personal invitations to Erasmus of Rotterdam, a leading humanist scholar, to reside in England and lecture on classical learning. Henry even took up the pen himself, composing Latin verses and English odes that celebrated virtues such as courage, wisdom, and piety. Yet beneath this erudite veneer lay an unrelenting thirst for absolute power, a power that he was willing to enforce at any cost, even if it meant extinguishing the lives of tens of thousands who dared to dissent. As the vigour of youth and the thrill of the hunt yielded to the inertia of chronic pain and advancing years, Henry's passions turned inward, toward the quiet pursuits of books and scripture. He personally supervised the printing of bilingual Latin-English editions of the Bible, ensuring that divine law could be read by his subjects in their native tongue. This act marked a watershed in English cultural history, inaugurating an era in which laypeople could engage with sacred texts directly rather than relying solely on clergy. The Great Bible, as it came to be known, found its way into parish churches and the hands of well-to-do merchants, forging a new bond between the crown, the church, and the literate public. Yet this remarkable cultural flowering sprang from the soil of ruthless policy. At the very moment Henry championed the spread of knowledge, his agents employed the same printing presses to churn out edicts condemning heretics, while fingers carved royal proclamations into woodblocks for swift distribution. The codex that opened minds to scripture also carried the death warrant for those who questioned the king's supremacy. Thus, the juxtaposition of enlightenment and extermination defined the Tudor ethos, marking Henry VIII as both benefactor of the arts and architect of terror. In faint candlelight, one might imagine Henry pacing the corridors of Hampton Court, pausing before a shelf lined with books he had acquired at great expense, yet glancing instinctively toward the portrait of Holbein that hung nearby. The painting's immaculate palette and composed posture spoke of majesty, even as Henry's heart pulsed with the memory of executions carried out in his name. The same mind that delighted in classical verse also orchestrated the dissolution of monasteries whose libraries contained irreplaceable manuscripts. In those silent passages between sleeping courtiers, the duality of his legacy echoed, a sovereign who nurtured learning even as he wielded it as a weapon. The power of Henry's cultural innovations would reverberate through English history. The bilingual scriptures paved the way for the English Reformation's intellectual underpinnings, empowering lay preachers and eventual dissenters to interpret doctrine on their own terms. The libraries he amassed became seeds for future collections. The scholars he patronized inspired generations of thinkers, and the art he commissioned set a standard for royal portraiture. And yet, the memory of the church dissolved, and the blood spilled in the name of royal prerogative could never be extricated from these achievements. The very presses that produced Holbein's images and parochial Bibles also printed broadsheets announcing traitors' condemnations, a reminder that art and atrocity walked hand in hand at the heart of Tudor power. So, as dusk deepens and the flicker of lamplight dances upon gilded frames and leather-bound tomes, we might consider Henry VIII in his full paradoxical complexity. He stands as an icon of contradiction, a monarch whose cultivated grace and intellectual pursuits advanced English culture, yet whose thirst for dominance led to terror and bloodshed. His legacy endures in the vaulted libraries, the stately palaces, and the very language we use to speak of authority and conscience. And in that uneasy union of beauty and brutality, Henry's story remains a gentle, haunting lullaby, an invitation to rest our eyes on the glories of art and the shadows they cast. As we drift into the soft embrace of history's slumber, the death of Henry VIII on the 28th of January in the year 1547 marked the final thunderclap of his tempestuous reign. He passed away amid squalor and sorrow, his once regal frame swollen with edema, his leg ulcer festered to an unbearable stench. Carried upon mechanical hoists and the strange shoulders of attendants through the echoing corridors of Whitehall and Hampton Court, he left only murmurs and fear in his wake. His parting words, smuggled through a half-closed door, were unintelligible to those outside, for even his royal surgeon dared not venture close enough to catch them, the odour so overpowering it drove men to flee in gagging horror. Legend holds that when the funeral cortege paused at Sion Abbey, en route to Windsor, the king's lead-lined coffin ruptured in a grotesque spectacle. Gases born of relentless decomposition swelled within its iron bands until, with a muffled roar, the coffin burst open. Reports speak of cloth and splintered wood raining upon the cobblestones, while servants scrambled to contain the tide of noxious vapours. Centuries later, in the year 1813, engineers unsealed the vault at St. George's Chapel and discovered conclusive evidence of this explosion. A jagged breach in the inner casket and metal implements, warped by pressure, far beyond that of ordinary interment. Upon his death, the crown passed to his only surviving son, Edward VI, a boy of merely 9 years. The young monarch's lamentable tenure lasted only 6 brief years before he succumbed to illness at the age of 15. His early demise ignited a fierce scramble for power among competing factions at court. Dukes, earls, and prelates manoeuvred to shape the kingdom's future, each claiming divine sanction. The Tudor line teetered on the brink of extinction, only to be retrieved by the hand of fate when Elizabeth, the king's resilient daughter, ascended the throne. Elizabeth I's 45-year rule ushered in an age of relative stability, known to posterity as the Elizabethan Golden Age. Under her guidance, England's arts and commerce flourished anew, the threat of foreign invasion rebuffed, and religious tensions eased by pragmatic tolerance. Yet no peace could fully erase the deep fractures left by her father's upheavals. Parish records bear witness to families torn apart by confiscations. Monastic ruins still dot the countryside, and whispered memories of tragedy haunted hallowed abbey walls. The cultural renaissance she championed rested upon foundations stained by blood. Henry's life stands as a testament to the cautionary maxim that absolute power is apt to breed absolute corruption. The Golden Prince of 1509, a paragon of charm and eloquence, metamorphosed into a despotic figure whose legacy was written in both verse and violence. His grand architectural visions, palaces that gleamed like gemstones, cut deep wounds in the treasury, while his zeal for religious control shattered centuries-old bonds between crown and convent. His personal lament became the country's curse. What he sought to command with iron would ultimately slip through his fingers, leaving chaos in its place. In the quiet hush of history's twilight, we find Henry VIII immortalized in portraits that both glorify and conceal him. Holbein's masterful brushstrokes capture only the majesty, not the agony. The raised codpiece, the gilded scepter, the regal stance, these endure in oil and panel, while the man himself lies forgotten beneath layers of legend and odour. His codices on theology and his patronage of humanist scholars are catalogued in grand libraries, yet each line of ink belies the ruin he wrought upon the lives of countless subjects. Modern medicine still recalls his name when examining cases of chronic venous disease and traumatic brain injury. Scholars debate the precise toll of his campaigns and reforms, but none dispute the human cost. Tens of thousands sentenced to death, families uprooted, faith manipulated as a means of control. The debts he amassed passed like a poison to his heirs, burdens that would shape England's economic and political landscape for decades. And so, as you drift toward sleep, remember the paradox of Henry VIII, a giant of power and personality, a patron of art and poetry, yet a harbinger of suffering and division. His story reminds us that greatness and cruelty may dwell within the same heart. In the final silence of the palace chambers, amid the drizzle of candle wax and the distant toll of chapel bells, the spectre of Henry lingers an eternal warning that unchecked authority, no matter how splendid its outward trappings, can never escape the shadows it casts. The funeral rites for Henry VIII commenced with solemn grandeur at Westminster Abbey. Candlelight flickered across vaulted ceilings as bishops in rich vestments intoned the funeral mass. Peers and prelates processed in heavy silks, their faces long and grave beneath ornate mitres. The royal hearse, its lead-lined oak case polished to a dull sheen, rested on a bier draped in sable and crimson. A hush fell over the assembled crowd as the great doors swung open and the body, swathed in ermine and velvet, was borne to its resting place. Yet beneath the veneer of ritual reverence lay a lingering dread. Those closest to the bier dared not linger too long, for the stench clung even to the stone floors. Once the service concluded, the coffin embarked on its final journey over 100 kilometres of winding road to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Muffled wheels turned on the frosty cobblestones, and attendants in sable cloaks flanked the procession, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. At every stage, the regality of the Tudor name seemed to crumble, for the rotting remains within had grown so foul that servants faltered, clutching handkerchiefs to their faces. Yet the rites pressed on, heedless of the odour that trailed like a silent spectre. When the cortege paused for the night at Sion Abbey, disaster struck in a manner both grotesque and unforgettable. The pressures of accumulated gases within the leaden vault mounted unnoticed in the quiet darkness. Then, with a sound like distant thunder, the coffin burst asunder. Fragments of wooden splinter and strips of ceremonial cloth erupted outward, showering the abbey's cloistered courtyard. A pall of rancid air billowed over the mourners, who recoiled in terror and disbelief. Servants scrambled with pails and hay-filled rags to contain the tide of decay that gushed forth, their laments echoing beneath the moonlit arches. The very earth itself seemed to shudder at the spectacle. Centuries later, in the year 1813, antiquarians and engineers exhumed the tomb at St. George's Chapel to verify the whispered accounts. When they pried open the heavy lid, they discovered a jagged breach in the inner metal casket, evidence that the legend was no mere myth. The vaulted lead had cracked from within, and the oak lining bore ruptures far beyond those of age. Windsor's own records, combined with the engineer's annotations, confirmed that the explosion was real. It had been caused by the relentless build-up of gases methane, hydrogen sulfide, from the slow decay of royal flesh, an invisible force powerful enough to fissure iron and wood alike. Never before had an invincible monarch been recalled to dust with such grim farce. The image of the great Henry, whose commands had toppled monasteries and reshaped a nation, now culminated in a final, catastrophic rupture. His death knell resonated not through prayers or hymns, but through the very walls of tradition crumbling under unnatural strain. In the decades that followed, the tale of the bursting coffin evolved into a potent symbol of Tudor decline. Historians and poets alike seized upon the scene as a metaphor. The same splendour that had forged palaces and patronised poets masked a rotting core. Just as an empire built on ruthless ambition and unchecked authority could fracture under its own weight, so too had the king's final vessel given way to the invisible gases of decay. By candlelight in scholarly studies, writers mused on the Tudor paradox. The monarch who had dismantled Rome's power and rewritten the spiritual fabric of England could not even secure a dignified repose. The violence of his reforms, religious, financial, familial, found a final echo when his coffin exploded, scattering fragments of cloth and memory into the night air. The abbey stones, once sanctified by prayer, bore witness to the king's last, unanticipated judgment. Thus, in the hushed aftermath, the legend of the exploding coffin became a cautionary tale told in bedtime whispers, an admonition that no measure of earthly authority could forestall the ultimate decay waiting within us all. In drawing his crown and cloak around himself in life, Henry had sought to conquer pain, sin, and dissent. In death, he was undone by the silent revolution of his own body's breaking. And so, as you close your eyes and the torchlight dims, recall the echo of that night in Sion Abbey, the tear in the coffin, the rush of fetid air, the stunned retreat of mourners into shadowed cloisters. Let it lull you into slumber with the knowledge that even the mightiest can be undone by forces unseen, and that every reign, no matter how towering, must yield at last to the soft but relentless hum of nature's reclaiming breath. Edward VI, the sole surviving son of Henry VIII, was but 9 years old when he ascended to the English throne. His delicate frame and the innocence of childhood stood in stark contrast to the burdens now placed upon him. In his name, the Earl of Somerset first governed as Lord Protector, wielding authority over court and council with zeal that mirrored his late brother's ambition. Somerset's tenure saw earnest attempts to stabilise the realm, yet his policies, both religious and financial, provoked unrest among the nobility. who bristled at the young king's chosen guardian. Before Somerset's star had faded, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, rose to power, likewise acting in Edward's name. Northumberland navigated the treacherous waters of court intrigue with measured caution, balancing the demands of reformers who sought further Protestant changes and conservatives longing for the old rights. Meanwhile, the treasury groaned under the weight of debts left by Henry. Interest payments devoured much of the revenue, forcing regents to debase the currency once more. Merchants, once emboldened by England's growing trade, found their coin clipped and their confidence shaken. Rural folk, already strained by successive harvest failures, endured heavier levies to fund the court's needs. Religious turmoil, a legacy of Henry's seismic break with Rome, continued to roil the realm. The Church of England, still in its infancy, teetered between Lutheran-inspired liturgy and more radical forms of worship imported from the continent. Somerset had introduced the Book of Common Prayer in English, prompting both hope and ire across parish churches. Under Northumberland, stricter enforcement of iconoclasm and the removal of popish decorations alienated many who clung to older devotional practices. Villagers whispered of stolen chalices and battered statues, while clergy cowered at the threat of fines or imprisonment should they dare celebrate Mass in Latin. In this climate of shifting loyalties and sown discord, Edward's half-sister Mary, daughter of Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, bided her time. A devout Catholic by conviction, Mary watched the Protestant reforms with mounting dread. When Edward VI's health finally faltered in the year 1553, her chance came swiftly. At the age of 15, Edward succumbed to a virulent illness, possibly tuberculosis or a rapidly advancing respiratory infection, leaving the infant king's reign to his memorial and the realm to a precarious succession. Mary, then in her late teens, claimed the throne in her own right. She faced fierce opposition from those who had prospered under the young Edward's Protestant regime, but she rallied loyal nobles and commoners alike by invoking her father's image as defender of the faith. Yet her pursuit of religious restoration took on an unyielding edge. In a fervent bid to undo the reforms of her predecessors, Mary authorized a campaign of repression against Protestants. Her first edicts banned the publication of English Bibles not sanctioned by Rome, and soon the machinery of the Inquisition was quietly mirrored in England. Over the next 5 years, Mary's forces executed thousands by burning at the stake, their names recorded in popular ballads and whispered warnings. Preachers accused of heresy were marched to their deaths in public squares, their last prayers snuffed out by licking flames. The sight of devout souls meeting such a fate hardened many hearts against Mary's cause, even as some welcomed the return of traditional rites. The flames that consumed the accused cast long shadows upon the throne, and soon Mary earned the sobriquet Bloody Mary. Her ruthless zeal, though thorough, could not erase decades of reform ingrained in the minds and practices of the populace. While she mourned the loss of the monastic orders and sought to rebuild links with Rome, many Englishmen remembered the enforced oaths of supremacy and the alienation of their forebears. Economic hardship, further aggravated by the crown's lingering debts, compounded the bitterness. Mary's own marriage to Philip of Spain, a union meant to secure Catholic succession, only fueled fears of foreign domination and entrenched sectarian distrust. When Mary's reign ended with her death in 1558, her cradle had borne no heir. The childless queen left behind a realm still torn between two confessions. The succession passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, herself a product of the religious maelstrom that had consumed their father's court. Elizabeth's succession restored a measure of stability, but the sectarian scars ran deep. Through Edward's short reign and Mary's blood-stained restoration, the Tudor dynasty revealed the fragility of a nation held together by faith and coin. The boy king and the bloody queen each, in their way, strove to realize the legacies of Henry VIII Edward to carry forward the Protestant experiment, Mary to reclaim the lost Catholic inheritance. Yet in both endeavors, the policies of their father cast long shadows: fiscal collapse, social disruption, and religious strife that no child or young queen could swiftly remedy. Thus, as the Tudor line wound its way from Henry through Edward and Mary to Elizabeth, each ruler grappled with the consequences of absolute authority wielded without restraint. The promises of reform and renewal bore fruit only at the cost of unity, leaving England to stumble through decades of conflict before emerging, at last, into an uncertain peace. And so we close this chapter, lulled by the echoes of boy kings and captive queens, of torches that lit both hope and horror as we drift further into the soft hush of history's embrace. Elizabeth I ascended the throne in the year 1558, following the death of her sister Mary, and ushered in what would be known as the Elizabethan era, a golden age spanning 45 years. With measured diplomacy, Elizabeth forged a via media, preserving the independence of the Church of England while extending an olive branch to moderate Protestants. Gone were the harsh burnings and forced oaths. In their place rose the gentle rhythms of a liturgy conducted in English, laced with a tolerance that soothed the wounds of 3 decades of sectarian strife. The Queen's subtle touch at the helm steadied the ship of state, guiding England through turbulent waters into a calm harbour of relative unity. Under Elizabeth's watchful eye, the English navy flourished. Shipyards along the Thames and the Solent hummed with activity as new vessels, sleek, formidable, and bristling with cannon rolled off the stocks. These ships would soon carry brave mariners beyond familiar shores, into the vast expanse of the New World. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh sailed under the Tudor standard, mapping distant coasts and forging trade routes that brought back exotic goods, spices, and tales of uncharted lands. The once inland-focused nation found its horizons expanded, its economy enriched by overseas commerce, and its national pride buoyed by naval triumphs over the mighty Armada. Meanwhile, within the realm of letters, English literature blossomed like the roses in the Queen's own gardens. Playwrights and poets William Shakespeare, whose quill captured the depths of human folly and passion, Christopher Marlowe, whose blank verse thundered with tragic intensity, Edmund Keats, whose later verses would dream of Grecian urns and human transience found royal patronage and eager audiences. Public playhouses, from London's Globe to provincial amphitheatres, filled with throngs of citizens eager to witness tales of kings and commoners, of love and betrayal, of the supernatural and the sublime. The printed book, too, spread swiftly, carrying sonnets, pamphlets, and philosophical treatises into the hands of the literate populace. Beyond drama and lyric, the visual and scientific arts advanced in tandem. Gentlemen scholars dissected plants in royal gardens, laying early groundwork for modern botany. Astrologers charted the heavens in painted celestials, while alchemists tinkered with base metals in hopes of transmutation. Architects drew inspiration from Italian palazzi, erecting stately townhouses and country manors that blended symmetry and grace. The delicate fusion of art and inquiry during Elizabeth's reign set a stage for the great scientific revolution of the following century, a time when the laws of motion and gravity would be unveiled, and the very nature of the cosmos reimagined. Yet beneath the veneer of cultural efflorescence lay the enduring legacy of Elizabeth's predecessor, Henry VIII. The national church he founded, freed from papal dominion, remained the spiritual backbone of the realm. The legal apparatus he established, acts of supremacy, royal injunctions, and statutes governing ecclesiastical appointments, persisted in law books and statutes. These frameworks allowed the crown to appoint bishops, regulate doctrine, and ensure that no foreign authority could supersede the sovereign's edicts. In doing so, Henry unwittingly planted the seeds of modern nationalism, forging a concept of nation, united by shared belief and allegiance, rather than by foreign pope or distant emperor. Under Elizabeth, this assertion of national sovereignty over religion reached full maturity. Clergy were required to preach loyalty to crown and country alongside salvation in Christ. Parish registers, kept in every church, recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials, all under the Queen's ever-watchful gaze. The principle of a national church, accountable ultimately to the monarch, became a fixture of English identity, distinguishing her realm from its continental neighbours. The bond between throne and altar, though fraught with past violence, now provided a semblance of order and continuity, anchoring the kingdom through internal and external storms. England's new status as a maritime power and a cultural beacon owed much to the Tudor foundations laid by Henry, but Elizabeth's steady hand and cautious tolerance allowed these elements to flourish. The silver that had filled the coffers during the dissolution of monasteries now underwrote voyages of discovery. The portraits that had once concealed ulcers and excesses now commemorated a sovereign who wielded her authority with discipline and poise. The printed word that had been used to condemn dissenters now spread news of English valour and verse that would echo through the ages. As the sun set on Elizabeth's 45-year reign, Her subjects looked to the horizon with confidence born of her steadiness. Schools and universities expanded, educating a new generation of thinkers and statesmen. Trade guilds formed, artisans honed their crafts, and commerce thrived in markets from London to York. The seamstress who embroidered the Queen's gowns and the sailor who navigated starry seas alike shared in the glow of an age defined by balance between faith and inquiry, tradition and innovation, royal authority and personal conscience. Thus, the Tudor legacy stands revealed in its full, paradoxical sweep. Born of Henry VIII's ruthless drive for absolute power and tempered by Elizabeth I's graceful pragmatism, the national church, and the nation itself, once fractured by doctrinal upheavals, found unity beneath a monarch who valued order over zeal. England emerged from the Tudor crucible as a unified realm, poised to step onto the world stage with new confidence. And so, as the torch flickers low and your eyelids grow heavy, drift into dreaming of galleons and sonnets, of statutes and sermons, and know that even the greatest storm can yield a golden dawn when tempered by thoughtful governance and a measure of mercy. Modern medical research still regards Henry VIII as a striking exemplar of combined traumatic brain injury and chronic pain. Contemporary analyses of his case highlight severe damage to the frontal lobe's regions responsible for regulating impulses, emotions, and decision-making. This injury, sustained in the jousting accident of the year 1536, is now understood to have disrupted the neural circuits that normally curb rage and anxiety. Simultaneously, Henry's chronic venous insufficiency, the festering ulcer on his left leg, ravaged soft tissues, introducing relentless nociceptive signals that bombarded his nervous system day and night. Viewed through the lens of today's clinical classifications, Henry would likely have been diagnosed with both post-traumatic stress disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. His repeated bouts of insomnia, erratic mood swings, and episodes of paranoia mirror the symptoms seen in patients whose brains have suffered frontal lobe contusions. In modern terms, the structural damage he incurred impaired his ability to inhibit fear responses, leading to hypervigilance and an exaggerated startle reflex. We see this in his habit of stationing loaded crossbows by his bedside, as though expecting assassination at any moment. The chronic pain from his ulcer compounded these psychological wounds. Persistent, unremitting pain is known to alter the body's stress response, increasing levels of cortisol and pro-inflammatory cytokines. Over time, this creates a feedback loop in which inflammation heightens pain sensitivity and the constant pain fuels anxiety and depression. Henry's own records of sleepless nights followed by 18-hour sleeps and descriptions of agony that pierce through bone and marrow align with the modern concept of central sensitization. The king's nervous system became conditioned to perceive even minor stimuli as excruciating, further eroding his emotional resilience. Medical historians cite Henry's case in textbooks on psychotraumatology, a medieval monarch whose physical suffering intertwined with psychological breakdown to tragic effect. Dr. Armenstein's 21st Century Review of Court Physician Notes describes intracranial hemorrhage and persistent skull fractures, offering a plausible explanation for Henry's impulsivity and cruelty. Meanwhile, Dr. Kira Kramer's work on chronic venous disease draws parallels between Henry's ulcer and contemporary patients requiring limb amputation to prevent systemic infection. Together, these analyses illustrate how a single accident could precipitate a cascade of disorders, neurological, vascular, and psychological, that robed a once vibrant ruler of his sanity. Henry's trajectory underscores the necessity of multidisciplinary care. In a modern context, a patient with similar injuries would receive an integrated treatment plan, neurosurgical monitoring and imaging for brain injury, specialized wound care, including vascular surgery or advanced debridement for chronic ulcers, pain management employing both pharmacological and non-pharmacological modalities, and psychotherapy or psychiatric support to address PTSD and anxiety. Cognitive rehabilitation would aim to retrain impulse control and executive function, while physical therapy could mitigate the disability imposed by the ulcer. Moreover, today's patient would benefit from a pain management team offering interventions such as nerve blocks, biofeedback, and guided mindfulness to reduce dependency on potentially harmful opioids. Psychologists and psychiatrists might employ evidence-based therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, to help process trauma and reduce hyperarousal. Social workers and case managers would ensure continuity of care, bridging the gap between acute hospital stays and community reintegration. Such a comprehensive approach stands in stark contrast to the brutal cauterizations and arcane elixirs of the Tudor court. Had Henry VIII had access to these modern medical resources, many of his most destructive psychological shifts might have been averted. Early neurosurgical assessment following his jousting injury could have identified subdural hematomas or contusions in need of surgical intervention, potentially reducing long-term cognitive impairment. Prompt and effective vascular care for his leg ulcer, perhaps including compression therapy and vascular reconstruction, might have spared him years of agonizing pain and infection. Regular psychiatric evaluations could have caught signs of PTSD and anxiety before they escalated into the paralyzing paranoia and rage that characterized his later years. The holistic model of care we now champion rests on the principle that mind and body are inseparable. Henry's suffering was not merely a matter of physical injury or mental anguish in isolation, but a synergistic breakdown of his entire biopsychosocial system. His case teaches us the perils of neglecting any one aspect. Unaddressed brain trauma can warp emotions and judgment, unmanaged pain can erode mental health, and untreated psychological distress can undermine physical recovery. Modern medicine has learned to break this vicious cycle through coordinated, patient-centered strategies. In reflecting upon the life and demise of Henry VIII, we find a cautionary tale for contemporary practitioners and policymakers alike. The stakes of comprehensive care extend beyond individual outcomes. A leader's unchecked suffering can reverberate through a nation, as Henry's pain and paranoia did through Tudor England. By contrast, timely interventions might have preserved not only his health, but also the stability and welfare of his realm. As the embers of this narrative fade and your eyelids grow heavy, consider the strides made since Henry's time. Imagine a world where no ruler or refugee, no laborer or child, suffers the compounded ravages of brain injury and chronic pain without hope of relief. Let the modern medical paradigm, rooted in collaboration among surgeons, physicians, therapists, and counselors, serve as the gentle balm to this turbulent Tudor chronicle. And now, drift away into the quiet hush that knowledge and compassion afford, where healing, rather than horror, holds sway. As we've seen, the life of Henry VIII offers more than a vivid portrait of Renaissance splendor and Tudor intrigue. It delivers a powerful cautionary tale about the interplay between physical injury, mental health, and unchecked authority. Through today's video, you've discovered how a single jousting accident precipitated a cascade of chronic pain, traumatic brain injury, and psychological distress that altered a once vibrant monarch into a figure driven by paranoia and cruelty. You've learned about medieval medical practices and their unintended horrors, and you've witnessed the lengths to which Henry went, both in his lavish patronage of the arts and his ruthless purges to maintain power and mask his suffering. The guiding message here is clear. Absolute power, without accountability, is a recipe for personal and societal disaster. Henry's story underscores the critical importance of multidisciplinary care, integrating neurology, pain management, and psychological support to prevent chronic conditions from spiraling into destructive behaviors. In the modern world, we have access to advanced therapies, mental health resources, and social checks that Henry could only have dreamed of. His life reminds us that when physical wounds are left untreated and emotional scars ignored, even the most capable individuals can lose their moral compass. Beyond the medical lessons, there is a broader lesson about leadership and empathy. Today's viewers can draw from this history the value of balancing authority with compassion, of listening to wise counsel rather than ruling through fear. Whether you're a team leader at work, a parent guiding a child, or simply a friend offering support, the Tudor example encourages us to prioritize holistic well-being, body, mind, and community over the hollow trappings of power. So take these insights into your own life. Advocate for mental health care. Ensure that chronic pain is managed with both medical expertise and empathy. And remember that true leadership arises from service, not domination. By acknowledging our vulnerabilities and seeking help when we need it, we can avoid the tragic mistakes of Henry VIII and build stronger, more compassionate communities. If you're still awake, then from all of us here, good night, and may your dreams be peaceful Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our most thought-provoking and engaging videos. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time.